Hi, everybody. She very kindly asked, hey, what do you want me to tell people about you before you get started? I'm like, I'm going to take care of that. And honestly, most people aren't going to care. They're going to care about the content. So I'll knock out the intro stuff in just a second. But before we do that, let's go ahead and get some extremely important business out of the way. This is probably the most popular CSS image on the web. But I have some others I like as well. This is my favorite CSS image on the web. Now, if you haven't done much CSS, you might be wondering, what is that supposed to mean? Well, here's what it's supposed to mean. And really, to sum up, all right, so now that we've set the tone, I'm going to try over the next 1 hour, 34 minutes to convince you that no, CSS is actually awesome. Okay. All right. So now that we've got that very, very important, technical diagrams out of the way, that bit about me. First of all, I did a similar talk, kind of cheerleading for CSS Grid a year ago this time. Who was in that talk? Okay, a lot of these jokes are going to seem really familiar. Try to ignore that. There will be new material, and frankly, I've gotten better at CSS Grid since the last time we talked, but just going to go ahead and give you that warning that some of this stuff may seem familiar. But even on the things that are familiar, I'm going to go a little bit deeper on them. So some of the examples you might have seen before, even though I made them, I now understand better how they actually work. So I'll be able to talk about them a little more intelligently than I did last time. Also, I've got more time. Last time around, I think I had about 40 minutes less. So it was basically, this is a cool thing. This is a cool thing too. Look at this other cool thing. And then we were done. With that in mind, I was asked how long we wanted to do questions. I am fine with staying until I have to get on a flight tomorrow morning at 6:30 a.m. If you have questions, I am here for you as long as you need. Given the kind of talk that we have here, and it's fairly code heavy, I don't know how much we'll actually be able to get out of like a 5-minute session at the end, but I'm perfectly okay with hanging around as long as people want to answer specific questions, or to try to give you whatever advice that I can give you on like the best technique to use in a certain scenario, or when to prefer one thing over the other. So even if we don't get to your particular question in that 5-minute session, totally okay. I'll hang around as long as you want. All right, so who am I exactly? Well, I'm this guy. This is one of the things that I do a lot. Do a lot of consulting for the nice folks at Oasis Digital, but I spend a lot of my time teaching this thing called Angular Bootcamp. Now don't worry, this is not an Angular specific session. There will be a fair amount of Angular in it, but it's mostly just a shell that will be able to do cool CSS stuff, cool CSS grid things on top of. But I want to warn you up front that you will see some Angular code. If that offends you, React people, I apologize. I like React too. It's fine. Vue people, however, get the hell out. No, all jokes, all jokes. I love all frameworks equally. The other thing that I'm often known for is Vim. So I have to put this picture up now. If you're not familiar with the O'Reilly tarsier, that's the kind of well-known symbol for Vim. But I founded a group called Vim Geeks out of St. Louis, Missouri in the US, and so I figured the tarsier needed to look a little geekier, so I gave him the cool shades. But I've done a lot of things over a long, long period of time. All this gray hair came from somewhere. CSS is one of those things that I've actually been doing since the days of Internet Explorer 3. Anybody remember when Internet Explorer 3 came out? We're talking mid to late 90s. And CSS had this amazing promise. It was going to finally let us do that thing that HTML, CSS, that they promised, which was you'll be able to have your markup, which describes what you mean. Semantic markup, and then all of your styling, all of your layout, all that other stuff that isn't what you mean, but how you want it arranged and how you want it to appear, it'll be somewhere else. It'll be over there in that style language where it belongs. And that was a dirty lie. I don't know if you've been doing web development as long as I have, but even if you haven't, you probably know that trying to actually realize that promise has been kind of a futile effort for way, way too long. I'm here with good news. It is more realistic today than it has ever been. So let's talk about that title, that mouthful of a title that I used in the proposal for this talk. User interfaces in the age of intrinsic web design, grid, flex, and modern CSS. Wow, that's a lot of words. Basically what this means is CSS grew up and got better while you weren't watching. If you're like me and you got burned over and over and over again by trying to use CSS the way we were promised, then I'm here to tell you that it got good. And one of the best things about it that's happened over the last couple of years is this cool thing called CSS Grid. So before we go any further, how many people here have actually used CSS Grid? Oh, cool, quite a few people. One of the first things we're going to do here in a minute is go through kind of the early stages of using CSS Grid, and I'm going to take you up to the point where a lot of people kind of tap out and they're like, all right, I was told this was great, but it doesn't seem all that much better. I really don't get it. And then we're going to push through that point, and I'm going to show you why you should really care. The other thing I want to talk about with this title, this intrinsic web design. Anybody heard that term before, intrinsic web design? I believe it was coined by Jen Simmons, a name that you're going to hear quite a bit in this presentation. She currently works for Mozilla as a developer advocate and has been a fantastic resource on modern CSS, especially around CSS Grid. And she's using this term intrinsic web design that kind of means what's come after responsive web design. Many, many years ago now, we had this revolution in the way we were designing websites where it was no longer like mobile websites and desktop websites. We had the ability to do responsive web design so that things would adapt to the size of the browser window, size of the viewport. But we really didn't get everything that we wanted out of that. Intrinsic web design takes advantage of this new era of CSS. Things like CSS Grid, things like viewport units, and lets us go beyond responsive web design. Truthfully, what it means is, in my mind anyway, CSS you can finally trust. We're going to see a lot of examples of that here in this talk. All right. So, let me show you what we're actually going to be living with for the next hour and 28 minutes. So here in the background, I've got a terminal window running with a bunch of scary text inside of it. This is the Webpack development server that lives behind the Angular CLI, which is hosting an Angular application, and you don't have to care about any of that. Angular is just the host for a bunch of cool things that we're going to be doing. What this does, though, is lets me run in my browser on port 4200 or on my browser on port 4200 this application. Now, this is a very serious professional application. So that's why it's got this cool effect, and it's also got Benny the Lego spaceman in the background. So you know this is a very sober, serious presentation. We're going to look at a whole bunch of different examples, and they're all hosted as like example components within this Angular application. The nice thing about doing this within Angular is Angular out of the box supports a cool thing called view encapsulation. It basically lets you put a whole bunch of tiny individual applications inside of this one application as if the only CSS that existed for that particular slice of the app was what's in that component. And I'll show you some code in a minute that shows that off. The other thing you need to know about this application before we jump into it is that it's not structured, at least visually, like a normal application. I wanted it to be possible for every individual example to basically stand alone. So I've got a menu of all of these individual things that I want to show you. We'll get to most of these, probably not all of them because we simply won't have time. But each one of them can basically take over the entire viewport. So, for example, when I show you the best feature ever that CSS Grid gives you, it's taking over the entire screen here. There's no menu bar at the top, no menu on the left or nav bar, anything like that. And that makes it really, really easy for me to show off all of the capabilities that I'm trying to demonstrate without having to worry about CSS or layout that I got from somewhere else. One other note about this. I don't have any slides, and that's very, very deliberate. I'm going to be showing you a lot of things that I could have taken a picture and put it in a Keynote deck or a PowerPoint deck, but I didn't want to do that. Everything that you're going to see that we're going to talk about is actually coming from the web browser. It's a combination of HTML and CSS and whatever bits of Angular and JavaScript that were necessary in order to get it onto the screen. But it's almost all HTML and CSS because I didn't want to do anything here that was going to be like JavaScript-driven styling or JavaScript-driven layout. There's nothing immoral about those things, but that's not the point of this talk. I want to demonstrate features that you can take advantage of in real applications, and I want it to be very obvious what's actually performing the actions that you're seeing. So a lot of these things that we're going to go through are deliberately very, I'm going to call them simple, but when you see the code, you might think, well, that doesn't look very simple to me, but they're very focused. The individual examples, like this one I was just showing you here, it's not trying to be an entire application. It just wants to be one particular kind of crystalline example of a technique that I want to show off. And as we get further into this, we're going to start combining a lot of these things, and the examples get more complicated, but still they're fairly focused. All right, so with all that in mind, let's jump into the first one of these examples. So on here, I call this the best feature ever. What do you think I'm demonstrating here? Exactly. Centering has been bloody difficult for too damn long. In fact, there are entire websites dedicated to how to center in CSS. I wish I had thought of this, because this could have been the way I retired. It's like literally, you need to put something in the middle of a page. Well, what year were you born? What is the barometric pressure where you're currently located? On and on and on, until finally you're like, all right, here is the code that gets you where you need to go. Here's what it looks like in the age of intrinsic web design and CSS Grid. So here is my example centering component, and it consists of some HTML, a little bit of TypeScript to kind of kick the component off, and then the necessary CSS to make that centering happen. Remember, the thing we're looking at is this guy, the satellite here. He's been centered magically on the page, and I mean really centered. If I resize this thing, he is staying right in the middle, no matter how big or how small the browser window gets. Awesome. We should get VC funding just on this feature alone. Here's what it takes to do that. I'm going to show you the TypeScript first, just so you don't have to worry about it. Again, the Angular stuff is basically superfluous, but it's here just to hold together this component. This component has its own CSS, its own HTML, and therefore it can kind of stand alone. But that's not really important. It's just, I'm showing this to you so you can ignore it. The important parts are the HTML. That is all of the HTML that we have in this example. Literally one image. Not even a class on the image, just an image with a source property. That's what's putting this satellite right here in the middle of the screen. But of course, there's some other magic hidden away. And that other magic is the CSS. Here's the CSS that does what you're seeing on the screen. Now, I've split it into two pieces, so you know what you need to pay attention to and what you don't. The stuff at the bottom, that's basically Bill figured out how to make a thing look like a planet in CSS. Don't care. That's not the important bit. The important bit is right up here at the top. We've said that this component that we're inside of is going to use display grid. Now, you've probably seen display block, display inline, lots of other display values. Display grid is the new one. Display grid says this thing is going to contain a CSS grid. Now later on, we're going to see a lot of examples of defining rows and columns and how big and how small and how they fit together. We don't even need to do any of that right here. Just the fact that we've said this thing is display grid lets us use this really cool thing called place items. What I'm saying is I have a grid and I want to place items within that grid, and those items are going to go into the center. Oh my God. Finally, after all of these years, we have the ability to say, put it in the middle. This is actually shorthand for two other properties. There's align items and justify items, and no one can tell them apart. Therefore, they gave you a shorthand that says, I want it to be both in the middle, right in the center. Do that. Place items in the center, and it combines both of them together. There actually is a trick to tell them apart. Aligning things is vertical, justifying things is horizontal, and if you think about your word processor and justifying text left, right, or center, you'll be able to remember, oh yeah, justifying things does it this way, aligning it does the other way. But if you really want to put something in the very middle of the page, all you need to do is place items center. Now, it may seem like I'm spending a ridiculous amount of time talking about centering, but first of all, I'm extremely excited about it because this was too damn hard earlier. Secondly, it gives you a clue to why things like CSS Grid are extremely important. And one of the key ideas in intrinsic web design, we now have control over the second dimension. We've actually had the ability to do things one-dimensionally for a long time. Flexbox came along and we thought it was going to save us all. But really, Flexbox only works in a single dimension. Now you can say whether that dimension goes up and down or left to right, but really you only have control over that one dimension. And that's fantastic if that's what you want to do. You get this flexibility in one dimension, even if that dimension wraps around over and over and over again. The problem is once it starts wrapping around, there's really no great relationship between those different rows. So if you're using flex to try to lay out a grid, you don't get very far. CSS Grid finally gives you control over that second dimension. Not only can you do things horizontally, you can also do them vertically. Or the other way around, you have control over both of them simultaneously. And even though this is a super simple example, it is doing that. It is controlling both the horizontal and the vertical simultaneously. All right, so with that in mind, let's make things a little more complicated. Oh, and before I go away, I'm amazed how many people don't know about this. People are aware of CSS units, but they're not usually aware of this particular unit or its close personal friend. Anybody here know what a VH unit is? Somebody shout it out. Yeah, viewport height. V is for viewport. What this is saying is, I would like to express height in terms of a percentage of the viewport height. In other words, whatever you can see in the browser, the viewport of the browser. So no longer are we trying to calc our way to like taking up all of the viewport or taking up a portion of the viewport. If I came in here and said, you know, I only want to take up half of the viewport height, then as soon as this thing finishes recompiling and refreshing, I'm taking up half the viewport height. I can do the same thing with the width if I wanted to, and I would use the VW unit, not Volkswagen, viewport width. Also have a couple of others, vmin, vmax, to be able to take like the smaller or the larger of either of those units. Makes it really fantastic to finally have control over what's going on inside the viewport of your application. Now, a lot of people think, wow, I've never heard of these things. They're really awesome. They've been around and widely supported in all browsers since like 2013. We're going on like 5-6 years where you could just assume they were available. You're going to see them used all over the place in what we're talking about today. And if you take nothing else away, just knowing that viewport units exist, huge benefit to your toolbox. All right, so let's put that back, reset. All right, we're going to make things a little more complicated here. I want to show off why grid matters. All right, so you might notice there's a theme to this presentation. Lots of space stuff. So here we have an article that features Carl Sagan and the pale blue dot. If you're not familiar with the pale blue dot, it's Carl Sagan talking about an amazing image that was taken many, many years ago of the Earth. And this is the image. Can you see the Earth? It's right there. That is the Earth. That's the pale blue dot taken from a bazillion miles away. And he wrote this amazing essay and then a book all about the pale blue dot. And everyone that you've ever known, everyone you've ever known of, everyone that's ever lived or died is on that pale blue dot. Really kind of puts you like in your place in the universe. We don't care about any of that here. We just want to lay out this article a little better than it is right now. Because right now, it's basically, there's a header at the top, there's some text, there's a really oversized picture, another really oversized picture, a quote from Carl Sagan, and then finally a footer that has the credit for what we're looking at in here. And I mean, there's nothing evil about this layout. It actually works. You can resize it and does the right thing, but we'd like to give it a little more pizzazz than that. So first of all, let's take a look at the code. So in here, in this example, we're calling this our sandbox because we're going to use it to play with the grid a little bit. Here's the HTML. So the whole thing is wrapped inside of a div that I've given a class of sandbox. So it makes it really easy to grab a hold of that div and do things to it. You can probably guess the first thing I'm going to do is make this a grid and start playing with the grid inside of the sandbox. But then I've got elements within that div like header, main, whole bunch of paragraphs inside of main, a couple of images, an aside, that's where Carl's quote is, and a footer. Now, if you're not familiar with these things, they're not specific to CSS Grid, and they're not all that new. They're the HTML5 sectioning elements. We do not need to use them for the example I'm about to show you to work, but they're really handy because they're semantically more valuable. They're more richer semantically than like divs with a class associated with them. They're also fantastic for screen readers. They're really good for accessibility. And since we're in an Angular application and this example is a component all by itself, we can consider whatever CSS we write to only exist for this particular component. In other words, we don't have to get really fancy with our selectors. which means that in our CSS, we can do things like grab an image and give it a width of 100%. Now, in a normal application that didn't use Angular's view encapsulation, this would be an act of terrorism, because you would have done something to literally every image in the entire application. We don't have to worry about that here because we are encapsulated inside this example. And this capability is not specific to Angular. You can do the same sort of thing with scoped CSS and React, or lots of other solutions in pretty much any other framework, or even vanilla JS. But keeps our examples really simple. That's the only reason I'm spending any time on it. So the only thing that's really happening in the CSS is just a little bit of stuff to make it very easy to see where elements are showing up on the page. So our div, which has a class of sandbox, we gave it a background color of light blue and a little bit of padding so that we can see it on the page. So there's where the light blue and the padding of 20 pixels is coming in. All of the stuff that's inside the sandbox, that's this selector right here, has a background color of white and a little bit more padding. So that's what gives us the white background on the header, the white background on all the paragraphs instead of main, and the space right here. So a little bit of room to breathe. And that's great, but that is not the layout we want. We want to actually put these things in something that's a lot more aesthetically pleasing. Anybody here ever heard of the Holy Grail layout? The Holy Grail layout is something that until fairly recently, far too recently, frankly, was really hard to do. So let me show you an example of the Holy Grail layout. Let's see. So here's the Wikipedia page for the Holy Grail in web design. You don't have to read all this stuff. Only thing you really care about is this picture. That is the Holy Grail web layout. A really big name for something that shouldn't be hard. A header at the top, a footer at the bottom, columns that stretch between the header and the footer, and then a content section in the middle that also stretches from the header to the footer. Very, very reasonable layout. Fairly hard to do until recently. I want to put our article in that layout. Well, the very first thing that I want to do is say that this thing is going to be not its default display value, but display grid. I'm going to save that, refresh, and show you that basically nothing changes. So I'll turn on the console here so you can actually see when it's recompiling. Everything looks the same. So going from display block, which was the default for a div, to display grid didn't make any obvious change. But I am going to make one other change to make it clear there is something going on. I'm going to do a grid gap. Now that grid gap is going to give me a little bit of space in between the individual items inside the grid. This shows us what the grid container considers to be items inside of this grid. It gives us a clue as to the way the grid actually works. The way that items are determined for this sandbox grid container, they're the first level children, the things that are immediately inside this container. So in other words, the header is a child of this grid container, but H1 is not. Main is an item of this grid, but this paragraph is not. So what do we have in this grid? Well, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 elements, all inside of this grid. Now, I haven't laid out this grid at all. I haven't done anything to it other than say, hey, this is going to be display grid, put a gap in between all the elements, but already we've got something valuable going on. We have the ability to separate these things apart. The layout is still relatively responsive. If I resize, it still does the right thing. It's not like anything's locked into position. But now I want to start taking advantage of grid's capabilities and do some fancier stuff. So first thing I want to do is lay out like a number of columns. Well, how many columns do we have in our holy grail of web design? 1, 2, 3. The header and the footer, they stretch across all 3 of those columns. But I want to start by laying out my overall page and saying there's going to be 3 columns, and we'll figure out the header and footer stuff in just a second. So first thing I want to do, grid, template, columns. And then I can tell it what I want my columns to be. Now I've got some tricks I'm going to show you later, but right now we're going to keep it really simple and actually just use pixels. So I'm going to say the column on the left-hand side is going to be 150 pixels. The one in the middle will make it 300 pixels, and the one on the right back to 150. Now all I've done so far is set display grid, give a gap between the elements, and set up some columns. Nothing else has been changed in this CSS yet. So let's see what happens on our page. Terrible things, but clearly there was a change. Now my header is all the way on the left-hand side. My content is in the middle. That's my main section. That picture's on the right-hand side. I've got 3 columns. Now I had more elements than just those 3, so what happens below them? Well, sure enough, they're being laid out columnar as well. So even though this is not the layout we want, you can already see the way that grid is affecting the overall layout on the page. Now, I can close this up and you can see that nothing here changed. I resize and nothing is like being responsive the way that it was, but that's okay, we'll get there. So let's make this a little better. Very first thing that I want to do is fix that header problem. Now I have an empty set of style rules down here. I want my header to stretch across the entire width of the layout that I've got there. So I'm going to say that the grid column start for this guy, what do you think the first column's number would be? 1. Absolutely, because this was not written for programmers, it was written for designers. Otherwise, it would start at 0. Nope, starts at 1. And I'm going to say that the grid column end, what do you think that's going to be? Remember, I want to stretch across 3 columns. 3, 3, 3, 3. Wrong. 4. I'll explain. Let's see what that does before I explain, though. Hey, look at that. Progress. Our header is now where we want it to be. It's stretching from all the way on the left to all the way on the right. And the reason that it's 1 to 4 is because we're not actually counting columns. Even though this thing says column start, column end, what it's really saying is, what line do you want to start at? And lines are 1, 2, 3, and 4. In other words, the very beginning of the grid, that's line 1. The very end of the grid is line 4. We have 3 columns, and we've got 4 lines among those columns. It's like the difference between fence posts and spaces in between the fence posts. And that's the way that we count in order to do things like grid column start, grid column end. We're saying go from this line to that line. Now I can shorten this notation a little bit. I can simply say, I know I want to go from 1 to 4. So just do that. So we'll save that, let it refresh, make sure everything still works. Everything's great. We can do the same trick with the footer. Down here at the bottom, we can say we want the footer. I'll show you what it is before I change it. We want that footer to stretch all the way across the bottom of the page as well. So save that, let it refresh, turn on my console, you can see it. And there, down at the very bottom, our footer is now doing the right thing as well. So we're making progress. This is great. We can control other things like where the main would go. Now, we've got 3 columns to work with here, but we wanted main to kind of be in the middle. Remember our holy grail layout that we're working with? This guy? So what would the definition be for the column layout for main? What line is it going to start at? 2. Exactly. So we're going to say grid column. We're going to start at 2 and go to 3, not all the way to the end. So let's see what happens here. Look at that. We're not done yet, but our header is stretching all the way across. We got our content in the middle. Carl's actually in a nice place. We like where he's landed. We'll leave him here for the moment. Footer is still stretching all the way across the bottom. But our aside, it's not where we want it to be. We'd like that to be on the left-hand side. So on our aside, we can say grid, column, and we'll put it in 1, and it'll only go to 1. All right, let's see what happens with that. Okay, it put it where I told it to put it, but it's not where I wanted it to be. So the header's still great. The section in the middle is great. The aside is in the right column, but it's not in the right row. Remember, grid's all about 2 dimensions, and we haven't told it anything about that second dimension. Now, I will warn you, this is the part where a lot of people begin to kind of check out on grid. They're like, you told me this would be easier. This doesn't feel easier. It feels like I'm back in 1998 doing a table-based layout. But I don't actually have TDs and TRs. I just have this CSS force field trying to put things in the right place, and it's really complicated. Push through that feeling. This does get better. In fact, I'm going to just stop doing it this way for a moment and show you that if you want to do this kind of layout, there's actually an appreciably easier way to do it. In fact, I'm going to go steal it just to save some time. So here's what I want to do instead. We'll take all of this stuff that we were working our way through, get rid of it, change our setup so that we're no longer even trying to do all that columnar definition stuff. Let's see if we're good. Look at that. That's pretty slick. Now we have our header where we wanted it. We have our aside where we wanted it. We have the main content where it belongs. Carl's over on the right where we liked him, but also our other picture's on the right now too, just nestled neatly below Carl, and our footer goes all the way across the bottom. And even better, now our grid layout is really easy to read. We actually have ASCII art of our layout. We know we have 3 columns, so there's header, header, header. The header needs to stretch across all 3 of those columns, so we repeat it 3 times. But we don't want our aside to stretch across all 3. We only want it on the left-hand side. We want our main in the middle, and we want the picture of Carl on the right. Seems weird that we're repeating that, but notice what happens in that 3rd column. We change the picture. So we want our aside to not only be in the leftmost column, but we want it to go for a couple of rows. We want main to go for a couple of rows as well, so we stretch it from here down to here. Remember, ASCII art of our layout. And then we have the picture of the pale blue dot where it belongs on the page. And then finally at the bottom, our footer stretches all the way across. I don't know about you, but once you can read that syntax, there's never been a clearer way to lay out a page. I would like these things in these places, please. Now, it looks like I've named these after the elements. I'm not limited to that. If you look a little bit further down, I've actually said what grid area each one of these things needs to land in. So the header lands in an area called header. The Carl class element, whatever that may be, is going to land in a grid area called Carl. I could have called these foo, bar, baz, whatever I wanted. I typically make them make sense, so the class corresponds to the area name or the element corresponds to the area name, but you can do whatever you want. The important thing is you've set up a grid layout using this grid template, and then you've said where each thing lands inside that template. Very surgical, very granular, exactly what you want and where you want it. Now the other thing that I did while you weren't watching is I've made this actually very responsive. Look at this. So previously we were using pixel-based layout. We were saying things were a certain width and number of pixels wide, but now everything stretches and squashes the way that we want it to. And the way that I've done that is with a wonderful thing that CSS gives us called fractional units, these FRs. FR means a fraction of the available leftover space. Now what do I mean by leftover? Well, let's imagine that I said I always wanted the leftmost column to be 300 pixels wide. Now that left column is going to get a little bit wider, and it's going to stay that wide. But the other two, they can actually change. And the way that's working is Grid is calculating, okay, I know I need to take up 300 pixels on the left-hand side, but then I'm going to have a bunch of space left over. I don't know how to apportion that space. Well, I'm telling you how to put it, how to apportion that space. Use 2/3 of it here and 1/3 of it here. Whatever fraction of the space is left over, I want to take it up in these certain places. This is a very simple thing to tell you about, but I can tell you that the fractional unit is one of the keys to Grid's power. With proper use of FR and a couple of other tricks I'm going to show you later, a lot of the media queries that you've probably built in your applications can just kind of go away, because we get the ability to control so much of the responsiveness directly in the layout that we've come up with. Now, just because I said you don't have to use media queries doesn't mean you can't use media queries with Grid. We've got a wonderful layout here, but notice what happens when we get too small. Doesn't work for us. We can fix that. All we need to do is change the layout based on a media query. So I can say in here, once we get below a certain size, and I've chosen arbitrarily like 600 pixels, then change the overall layout. So now watch what happens. Get below 600 pixels, and our layout changes accordingly. And I'm not limited to just the order that the elements come in. Notice in here, I happen to be saying, put it in header, aside, and then main order, but maybe I really want the picture of Carl at the top. So now when I get below 600 pixels, Carl jumps up to the top. I don't know about you, but this would have saved me a lot of time in my life. This is hugely useful. Now, with great power comes great responsibility. You don't want to do this in a way that's going to compromise the accessibility of your application. But used wisely, used carefully, used surgically, this is really, really helpful. Now, I happen to be using this particular layout because it makes sense for a narrow screen width, but I can have dozens of these layouts if I want to, and change them arbitrarily however I would like based on whatever criteria I would like. All right, so you kind of get in the picture of the way that grid is held together, the sort of things you can do with it. We're going to see a lot more examples of it, but I wanted to kind of give you this quick tour of it before we did anything else. All right, so let's make this big again. Go back to our menu. Now, we were looking at this thing that looked a lot like a typical blog post, article, essay, whatever, but I want to show you a simpler grid just to get you familiar with kind of the anatomy of the grid. I've already mentioned a few terms, things like row and column and gap. There's a lot of those terms, and it would be useful to understand them in a way that it's like, or see them in a way it's very obvious where they are on the page. So I'm actually going to take this and flip over to Firefox. Now, why am I changing browsers? Because Firefox today has much better tools around layout than Chrome does. So it looks exactly the same here, but if I open up my dev tools in Firefox and I go to the layout panel, notice I've got a section for grid. And here I can do things like turn on the actual grid overlay. Now, up until a moment ago, you only saw 9 items in the grid, but this grid is actually quite a bit larger than that. I've defined 5 columns and 5 rows, and when I turn on the grid overlay inside of Firefox, you can actually see those defined. And it does things like tell me those line numbers. So remember I said that lines don't start at 0, they start at 1, so there's line 1, line 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 over on the right-hand side. You can see all that in the dev tools for Firefox. Chrome has some of this stuff, but it's not nearly as mature yet. So if you look in here in Chrome and we inspect this particular element, we dive down to it, you can actually see a lot of that grid layout here, but you don't get the nice numbered lines, and later on we start talking about named grid areas. You won't see those named grid areas. They're coming along, they're better than they were even a month ago, but Firefox today is still a much better place to do debugging of your grids. We'll see an example of that in just a minute. All right, so over here in Firefox, let's talk about the parts. Each one of these things, the 1, 2, 3, the numbered green squares that we got here, those are the grid items that I was talking about earlier. So whatever you put inside the grid container, they're the items of that grid, and whatever rules you've defined are what are used to lay out those items. So where are the items actually laid out? They're laid out in these grid cells. So the little squares here that you see, those are the individual cells of the grid. Something does not have to be in every cell. As you can see right here, we're only taking up 9 out of the 5 by 5, the 25 cells that we've got. Now, if you want to see each individual cell, the dev tools actually give you the way to like say, oh, there is that particular cell. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that if you notice, we've got a whole bunch of things listed under this overlay grid. Every one of these individual items that I've got is also a grid. So if I turn on the grid for, say, that one, notice I've got more grid stuff showing up. A little hard to read because I've got 2 grids lit up on the page. Turn one of them off and now you can see the other one. Now, why am I showing you this? It's because if you've used things like, say, Bootstrap or Foundation or any like grid system that you had to adopt from some CSS framework, you probably are used to like staying away from nesting grids. You don't have to stay away from it anymore. CSS grid nests beautifully. You can have grids inside of grids inside of grids. It can be grids all the way down, and it works really, really well. And the Firefox Dev Tools give you the ability to see that. So I can turn on the individual grids for all of the items on the page. They can all have independent definitions of one another. They're not like related grids. All right, so a little more terminology. Mentioned grid items, mentioned grid cells, we talked about grid lines. We have rows and we have columns. There's a generic term for a row or a column, and it's a track. So when you hear people talking about grid tracks, they're talking about either a row of the grid or a column of the grid. And there are things that we can do with tracks, like size them. And you can see us do it for both horizontal and vertical tracks, or rows and columns. These areas that are a bit shaded, those are gutters in the grid. Nobody calls them gutters. Everybody calls them gaps. And they can actually be, the size can be controlled with the grid gap that you saw me use earlier. In fact, this is such a useful concept that it's kind of creeping outside of grid now, and it's just generically called gap. So you can use grid gap or gap in any modern browser, and it'll do the same thing. And I've set the grid gap here to 20 pixels. By default, nothing shows up in those gaps. But later on, when I start talking about spans, you'll be able to see things spanning across those gaps. All right, lines, rows, columns, tracks, gutters. The only other thing I want to mention here are areas. Now, each one of these cells is basically its own area, but we could also grab, say, all of this giant rectangle here and put something in that whole thing. You've seen us do this already with the article. We took an entire area of our grid with the header and another area with the main content and another area with the aside. And that terminology you'll see come into play later on when we start taking real advantage of those grid templates with named areas inside. All right, so now that we got enough terminology to play with, let's make things more complicated again. Flip back over to Chrome. And get a little more complicated grid up on the screen. So this lets us go a little bit deeper on our debugging tools. In here, we've not only got the individual items, we've got some of those items overlapping one another. And that's not actually a mistake. Something that's been too hard to do in HTML and CSS previously is like control the way that things overlap with one another. You could do it, but you had to use things like absolute and relative positioning and z-index and all this stuff. You still got all that stuff available to you, but with grid, it's actually very, very simple. You basically say, these two things occupy the same cell, or parts of them occupy the same cell. And the overlapping just takes care of itself. It's not an error, it's a feature. All right, so flipping back over to Firefox, let's see what this thing looks like in the Firefox Dev Tools. Same grid that we had before, but now notice that we're actually in a slightly different position on the page. So I've zoomed out a little bit so you can see we're not stuck in the upper left-hand corner anymore. Therefore, our grid overlay looks a little bit different than it did. Our columns and rows and tracks, they're all still available to us. All the grid cells are the same size, but things are now in the middle of the page. But our entire grid is actually still starting up here in the left-hand corner. That seems a little bit unusual, so let's take a look at the code and see what's going on. So here in our example debugging component, little bit of Angular here. All I'm doing is repeating a div a certain number of times. So this is Angular speak for take this div and make a bunch of copies of it. Each one of the copies has a different label, different title on it, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's how I end up with each one of the individual grid items. The important bit, though, is in the CSS. So in here, we've said this whole thing is display grid. We're going to place content in the center, and I'll show you what that means in just a second. And we've set up our grid definition. We've said that we want 5 rows and 5 columns. Now, I could have said 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels, and so on, but life's too short. So grid gives me a really handy way to do that. I'm saying I want to have this same thing repeated 5 times. So give me 100 pixel columns 5 times. Give me 100 pixel rows 5 times. That's how I end up with the grid that you see here, 5 rows, 5 columns. But the weird thing is, I'm sitting in the middle of this page, which is not what I expected. That's coming from place content. I told you about place items earlier. Place content is another one of these alignment or justification capabilities. It basically says, I have a grid container, and I have a grid happening inside that container, but I need to know exactly where to put the grid itself. If I took this away, if I comment it out, refresh this page, you'll be able to see this ends up back in the upper left-hand corner again. If I turn on the grid overlay, just like we've got right here, you see the entire grid overlay is basically the same, except I don't have all that stuff happening on the left and at the top because I haven't moved the content of the grid into the center. The reason I'm telling you this is because sometimes people get very confused about how to actually control the item placement, the placement of the grid itself, and then like alignment within the items. Grid has the ability to do all of that stuff. So there's justify items, align items, justify content, align content, or the shorthand versions, the place content, place items. Now, until you get used to it, you'll just have to try them and look it up. But it's there, I promise. The other stuff here is basically making the divs something you can see on the screen. The only thing I really want to point out here is this nested grid inside of our overall grid. Like I mentioned, you can nest grids arbitrarily deep. So each one of the individual divs is also a grid. Now it's only being used to place content in the center. In other words, I wanted the number to show up in the middle of each individual item. So I took advantage of the fact that Grid has really good centering capabilities, set each one of the divs to display grid, and said put the content right in the middle, put the items right in the middle. Everything else, just cosmetics. Now, I've set up the individual divs to all look like that, but I wanted particular divs to look different. So in other words, I wanted like div number 4 to be in pink. So if I look a little lower, you can see how I grabbed a hold of div number 4. I said, one of these is going to have a title of 4, make it pink, and give it a different size. Make it span 2 rows. And that's exactly why 4 takes up 2 rows in the grid. 3, light blue, starts on row 3, spans from column 1 for 3 columns. That's why it's that size. That's why it's that place on the grid. All right, so this is great. It really looks like the Firefox debugging tools can help us a lot. We can see our grid without having to do anything special. And that's actually a really important clue to the way that grid works in the world of HTML, CSS, DOM, etc. The grid is not something you can style. The grid is not an HTML construct. It is a set of styling rules. It is layout, but it's not something that you can reach in and say, make my grid have a chartreuse border. You actually have to have items. You got to like style the container that has the grid inside of it. And sometimes that can be a problem because I've got a secret. There's an item in here you can't actually see. Remember when we were generating our divs? I said that I'm going to generate one of these divs for every individual label. Well, if I look at my TypeScript where those labels came from, the loop says go from 1 up until just before 10. In other words, 9. I should have 9 divs visible on this page. But all I can see is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Number 9 is missing in action. And even if I hover over like the individual items here or the individual cells in the grid, I can't see where that would be. So I'm going to show you the console logging of CSS. If I come in here and add myself a rule that says, you know, anything that's inside of this particular element that we're in, give it a 3-pixel solid red outline. Now this :host selector is just a way of saying, grab a hold of my current component. I could just as easily have had some sort of wrapper div like we did with the sandbox with the Carl Sagan article, but I don't need that. I'm already sitting inside of an element. So I'm saying, grab a hold of that element and anything that's inside of that element, like 1 level deep, light it up with a red border. Save that. Wait for it to refresh. And you see a whole bunch of red borders, including this one. That's an item in the grid. That's number 9. But some evil designer added this styling to number 9 and said, turn off the border, make the color in the background transparent, stick it in a particular place in the grid, but don't actually make it visible. So this is a nice debugging trick if you actually want to see everything that's inside of your current grid. The Firefox Dev Tools, the Chrome Dev Tools, they're fantastic, but sometimes what you need is the ability to say, show me every child. And this little trick is one that I use to do that. Again, the :host is not the important part. That's basically just a way of saying, whatever element that I'm inside of, every one of its children, give it a 3-pixel solid red border. And pull it out 5 pixels away from it. A lot of people, instead of using outline, will use border. Border works basically the same way, except it actually changes the amount of space the element takes up. So I use outline instead when I can. All right. Making good progress. Let's start putting some of these ideas together. Slightly more realistic example. So continuing with the space theme. This is a whole bunch of Planetary Nebula. I'll close this so you can see more of them at one time. Now, it's an image gallery. I've seen a million of those. But watch what happens when I start resizing this image gallery. Notice what's happening to the images. They're squeezing. In fact, if you watch this one very carefully, you can actually see the proportions are changing just slightly. And then eventually, we run out of room and we change the number of items on the row. Now, we've been able to do things like this before, but it wasn't easy. And sometimes it took code as opposed to just markup to do it. Here's what it takes with CSS Grid. So here in our image gallery, first thing I'm going to show you is where we're getting our images. This is a little bit of Angular code that says, hey, go grab a whole pile of images from this data source that I've got set up. Again, I'm showing this to you so you don't have to worry about it. Then, in my HTML, I'm saying, show me one of those images for every one of the individual image items that I just retrieved, and give it a title that is the name of whatever the Planetary Nebula is. So if I hover over this thing, you can actually see the title show up. This is the Little Dumbbell Nebula. So now I've got all of these images on the page, and I can play with them. Here's what the CSS looks like in order to lay out this image gallery. No surprise, start off with display grid. Give it a grid gap so everything's not slammed right together. But then we end up with a couple of things we've never seen before. I'll start with the simple one. Grid auto rows. We haven't seen the word auto yet. Sometimes you don't want to say, I want 5 columns and 5 rows. Sometimes you don't know how many items you're going to have. So you need to give Grid the ability to automatically create more rows or more columns for you if you need to. You can do it with Grid auto rows or Grid auto columns. Basically what we're saying here is every time that Grid automatically creates a row for us, make it 150 pixels high. So far so good. This one is a little more complicated. This is using that repeat trick that we just saw, but it's not repeat of 5 and then like a number. It's saying that we want to we want to automatically fill up all the available space that we've got with cells that are a minimum of 150 pixels wide up to 1 fraction of the available space that remains. So this combination of repeat plus autofill plus min-max is what gives us this really slick behavior. You can actually see the size changing of the image itself. And when it runs out of room, in other words, when you can't get below 150 pixels, it says, all right, take that one down to the next row. This works for more than just images, by the way. You'll see me use it again later in just a second with cards. Other stuff in here, we've pretty much already seen. We said we want this whole thing to be at least as high as the current viewport, and the reason that I do that is so that I don't ever have to wonder if I'm going to, have my background stretching all the way top to bottom. So I took away that minimum height requirement, then I'm going to zoom way out. And notice I lost my gray background. But if I come in here and put the 100 VH back, even if I'm zoomed way out, I now take up the entire 100% of the viewport height with my background. Not a grid-specific thing, but really, really handy to know. The only other CSS that's in here is this image rule. And again, we're taking advantage of the fact that we have scoped CSS to do this crazy just do it to every image, because it's not really doing it to every image, it's only doing it to the images inside of this particular example. But we're saying that we want the images to take 100% of the room inside of the individual grid cell that we're within, and we want to do this cool object fit cover trick. Again, another thing a lot of people don't have any idea about. It's a way of saying, here's how I want you to position the image within the particular space that I've given you. If I took away this object fit cover, should see a difference in the way these images actually look. You have to look closely, but you can see that we're now actually taking up different places within the images. If I took away some of these other rules, then you would see the images themselves would have different shapes. All of these images aren't square. But because I've set up a grid and I've set up sizing on the particular images, they all look like they're the same size. So if you have a whole bunch of images that are of roughly equivalent but not exactly the same proportions or aspect ratio, this is often a really good way of making them all fit within your design. All right. Now, this is cool, but if you notice, we've gone back to setting up columns and row rules, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I really want you to understand how often being able to define an actual grid template can be. And you're not limited to just the overall page layout. So let's switch away from the space theme for just a second and take a look at a deck of cards. Now I'll zoom way out of this so you can see we've got all of the cards in a typical deck. So all of the different ranks, all the different suits. Now you can probably guess we're using grid to lay out the overall set of cards on the screen. And unlike with the images, I didn't want the cards changing size. I want the cards to be of a certain size. I want them to stay that way. So even if I zoom out, you can see that as I resize the page, it's like, oh, I no longer have enough room, so I'm going to shift that card down to the next row. Sometimes that's exactly the behavior you want. That's what I wanted here. But what I really want to show you is the individual cards themselves. Disclaimer, I am not recommending you actually do it this way. I just want to show you the trick with grid. All right. So here in our playing cards example, we start off with a little bit of angular magic that lets us roll through all the suits and all the ranks in order to show a playing card component. Now, ng-container is just a way of saying, I need a little bit of logic here in my HTML, but I don't want any elements to be left behind by that logic. So ng-container iterating over all the suits and ng-container iterating over all the ranks says, just do these loops nested inside of one another. The only thing I want to leave behind are individual playing card elements. And if I look in the actual DOM, you'll be able to see each one of those individual playing card elements once I resize this thing. Come on, there we go. So here's our playing card, here's another playing card, on and on and on. So we've just iterated over all of the suits and the ranks to see each individual card. I've got some CSS that says display these cards in a grid. Repeat autofill 2.5 inches gets away from that min-max stuff, so I don't have that 1FR anymore, but it does say I want as many 2.5 inch blocks as you can give me. And as soon as you run out of room for one, change the number of blocks, move things down one row, keep going. Grid gap, 1/2 inch, padding 1/2 inch, so I'm not limited to just pixels. I've got all the CSS units available to me. That's what gives me this overall layout on the screen. That's boring. Who cares? The interesting part is in the playing card itself. So if I look at my playing card component, well, first of all, I'm going to terrify you. There's the HTML for the playing card component. Don't worry too much about this. This is just a little bit of HTML plus Angular in order to get all the pieces on the page. So if you look closely, you can see that this whole thing is one giant div that is the playing card itself. And then I'm going to have the rank of the card, like ace or 2 or 3. I'm going to have a symbol, the pip, the spade, the heart, the diamond, etc. I'm going to have potentially an image for the face cards, the king, the queen, etc. And then I'm going to have a certain number of divs for each one of the individual pips. So if I'm looking at the 8 of clubs, I'm going to have 8 little club symbols. Notice, I haven't laid out any of this. I've simply said there's going to be a rank. There's going to be pips in the middle. There might be an image in the middle, but I haven't said where any of them go. The closest thing I've got to lay out on this page is the fact that all this stuff is sitting inside of a playing card div. All of the layout's happening in CSS. Specifically, it's happening in a Sass file because I wanted to take advantage of some of the cool Sass stuff, but you could do all this with just raw CSS. It becomes raw CSS by the time Sass is done with it. So I'm going to skip over some of these details, and I want to get down to the point where I'm showing you what a playing card looks like. So if you look closely, you can actually see all those pieces. In the upper left-hand corner, you've got the rank. Right underneath that, you've got the symbol. In the middle, you've got this thing I'm calling design. That could be the face of the face cards, or it could be the pips in the middle, the 8 clubs, for example. And then we've got the symbol flipped upside down on the bottom right, and the rank flipped upside down on the bottom right. And you can see all of that happening in each one of these individual cards. So here's our 8 of spades I was just talking about. You've got the symbols, one of them upside down, one of them right side up. You've got the ranks, you've got the pips in the middle. But even with the layout that I've shown you so far, that doesn't actually tell me all of the things I need to know about this particular design. So if we look further down, you'll see every one of the individual cards laid out. Again, I'm not necessarily recommending this as a strategy, but I want you to see the sort of things that grid template areas can do. Get the idea? And then finally at the end, I've said where to put each one of those things based on all the areas that I just set up. So I've got grids inside of grids inside of grids. In fact, if I go into the Firefox Dev Tools with this guy and start turning on the grid overlay, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So here's my layout for my overall. Let's make this like a bright yellow here. Hopefully you can see that. So there's the overall grid layout. You see the gaps in the middle. You can see the line numbers. The individual playing cards, they have their own like outermost grid. I'll turn it on for, say, this one instead. No, let's do 7 so you can see all the pieces. So there's the outermost grid layout for the 7 of spades. And then the design in the middle is also a grid. See that? If I turn them all on, it's really impressive, but not terribly helpful. Grid, 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 all the way down. You're totally not limited to arbitrary nesting of grids. Works really, really well. All right. So I mentioned the fact that we can span things earlier, and I wanted to show you another little deeper dive on that. So here we've got some of the planets in the solar system. Poor Pluto got left out. And the smaller ones, they're all taking up one individual grid cell, as you would expect them to, but Jupiter really needs more room. Saturn really needs more room. And all I've done here is I've said these individual planets are taking up more of the grid. So this is a fairly simple example, but it does show off an important concept. So here's my HTML. Again, I'm just iterating over a list of image items. In this case, it's all the planets. I've got one image for each one of those items, so I end up with 8 of these images. I need CSS to lay them out. Here's the CSS that lays them out. You've seen this before. We have the ability to repeat a certain set of rules over and over again. I'm saying that each one of these items is going to be 100 pixels and make as many of them as you got room for. And then I'm going to have multiple rows, so make each one of the automatically created rows 100 pixels high. That's how I end up with these little square blocks. A thing we haven't seen before is this grid auto flow capability. Now you might be thinking, well, if all my grid items are potentially different sizes, what if I don't have room for some of those grid items? Well, let me show you what happens. If I take away this grid auto flow dense and refresh this, and wait a month, notice we've got a missing piece here. We got something left out. Everything is on here. If you count, there's still 8 items on the screen, but we ran out of room for putting Saturn. So we couldn't put Saturn in that space, so we went down to the next row, put Saturn there instead, and kept going. But you can tell Grid, you know, I kind of want you to fill in anything, even if you have to put things out of order in order to do it. So now, notice, we got that spot filled in, and the overall grid layout is different than it was before, because we can control how Grid automatically fills in the grid with the dense versus the default algorithm. Here's how I'm actually setting up the items that I wanted to take up a different amount of room. So Jupiter, I'm saying he's going to span 2 rows and 2 columns. That's why Jupiter is a bigger square than everybody else. Saturn, I want to span 2 rows and 3 columns to give room for the rings. Now notice I didn't say anything about where they land in the grid. I didn't say they start in a certain column or start in a certain row. I simply said, here's how big they are. And Grid takes care of the flow for me. This is a super powerful feature of Grid. If you're dealing with the right use case and you can take advantage of the fact that Grid can just kind of lay things out for you, you definitely should. There's a whole lot less work for you to do then. All right, but sometimes you don't want to just lay things out so that they're not touching. Sometimes you actually want to be able to overlap things. We saw a simple example of that earlier with our blocks, but we can actually control that more explicitly. So if I come back here and look at when worlds collide, nothing is currently overlapping, but I have positioned things in different places on the grid. So if you notice, there's a lot of blank space here, and it's not because I didn't set the auto flow algorithm to dense. It's because I said, I want Saturn to go here, I want Jupiter to go here, I want Earth to go here. And here's how I did it. Just as we had before, we're setting up a simple set of rows and columns, and then I'm specifically positioning things like Mercury and Earth. So let's take a look at where Earth is. Earth is going to be on grid row 4 and grid column 4. So let's grab this, put it into Firefox Dev Tools, turn on our grid overlay after I make this a little bigger. And make this easier to see. So let's make this black. So I said Earth wants to go right here, and that is line number 4 and line number 4. And that's exactly what we see. Row 4, column 4. Counting the number of lines down, I put Earth exactly where I wanted it to be. Now I put it z-index 1. There's no reason for that yet because there's nothing overlapping. There's nothing in the way. But if I want Earth to appear in front of anything else, that z-index 1 is going to make that possible. So let's try to make some things overlap. So let's see. Jupiter is currently just sitting in the leftmost column. So if we look at Jupiter, you can see that I've said put him on row 3 and give him 2 columns. Or excuse me, 2 rows. But with column, I simply said span 2. Let's actually put him somewhere. We refresh. We refresh. Now notice what's happened. Jupiter has ended up in a very specific spot. Earth sitting right on top. This is not a bug, this is a feature. We're actually able to stack things. We're able to overlap things very, very easily in Grid. Again, it was possible to do this before, but it was painful. Now it's really, really trivial. You can put one thing and one other thing and use z-index to control what shows up in the front. Really simple. All right, so let's get a little more realistic. I'm going to skip over the Plato would be proud. That's a little bit about forms, and we'll do I object. So unlike our image gallery example or our colliding planets example, this is something you might actually see in a real application. This is a whole bunch of cards. The data set here is actually women in astronomy, astrophysics, that sort of thing. In fact, if we look carefully, we actually have someone that's here. Pamela Gay, lady that gave the keynote. Friend of mine, lives like 3 miles away from my house. And a whole bunch of other people as well. And these cards are all coming from that data set of women astrophysicists, women astronomers. We've created a card for every one of them. So if we look at our HTML, you can probably guess what you're going to see. It's one of these, what I'm calling a media object for every one of the images with the label, the thumbnail, and the description. All of that feeding into that media object. Now, media object is something I made up. It's a very common term that we use. Like Facebook is basically built out of media objects. When you see Facebook posts, you typically see an avatar, you might see a subject line or a header, and then you might see some content. That's exactly what we've got here. We've got an avatar or an image, we've got like a header line, and then we've got whatever description would accompany it. Now, I wanted these cards to lay out kind of like our playing cards did, but I wanted them to be a little bit squishier. I wanted them to be more flexible. And we have that. So you see what's happening is we're resizing these things until we get to a certain point, and then we automatically flip to a smaller number per row, but the individual cards themselves get bigger. Like I mentioned earlier, we weren't limited to images having this flexible behavior. We can do the same thing with these custom components that we're creating, or with arbitrary HTML. Works fine. So our media object, much like our playing card, is a separate component. Here's what its HTML looks like. Notice how simple it is. We've got an image, we've got a header, and we've got a div with a class of description. I could use any HTML I wanted in here. I just wanted to keep it really, really simple to show you I'm not using HTML for layout at all. All the layout is happening inside the CSS. Here's our old friend, the grid template, where we're putting our image on the left, and notice it's taking up 2 rows. We're putting our header above the description, and then we've set up the individual measurements. We've said that the header row is going to take up whatever amount of space we need. That's what the auto means. So if I made that font really big, it would just automatically expand to take it up. The description is going to get no smaller than 100 pixels, but it's going to take up to one of those entire fractional units. So these are the row measurements for each one of the rows of our grid template. And then after a slash, we've got the column measurements. The image is always going to be 100 pixels wide. The cell of the grid is going to be 100 pixels wide, so we have consistent size for all of our images. You can probably guess what's going to happen down in our image rule. I've got that object fit cover that basically says, use the space you've got and position yourself accordingly. don't like change the size of the image. We want the image to take up exactly the amount of space that we've given it. Object fit cover helps us out there. Everything else in here you've seen before, with the exception of this. This is a wonderful little trick that I don't necessarily expect you to understand, but put it in your pocket and take it home with you. Remember that you saw this. Much like the repeat with the autofill and the min-max is super useful, and you'll see it all over grid definitions, this is another one of those tricks that until you know it, you'll get really frustrated. This basically says, allow this middle column to potentially squeeze down to nothing. The reason that I did it is so that I would get exactly the behavior that I wanted out of those center columns and could basically control what happens with that description text and the header itself somewhere else. Notice the headers are growing these ellipses as they get too small. The descriptions are wrapping appropriately. All of that is courtesy of the combination of that min-max rule plus some other tricks that I did down here in the CSS, like saying that my header is not going to wrap on white space. Any overflow is going to be hidden. And when you overflow the text, put 3 dots. But if I didn't have the min-max 0, 1FR trick, this would kind of be for nothing, because I'd end up with that description and that header flowing outside of my div, and that's not what I want. In other words, we'd end up back with the CSS is awesome problem. This helps you solve that problem. All right, so like I said, this is a more realistic example, but it still feels very rectangular. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The web is built out of rectangles, but sometimes we don't want to be limited by that. And I want to show you that even though grid is all about setting up rectangular areas, don't feel like that necessarily has to be a constraint. So if we take a look at, I'll skip over this one and go to the I want to break free. So this, much like we had a whole bunch of female astrophysicists and astronomers, these are women who've been to space. It's a whole bunch of like playing cards or trading cards for individual female astronauts. So zooming in, you'll see some familiar names. A lot of people you probably haven't ever seen before. But the main thing I want to show you is that, notice what's happening. As I'm hovering over these, the individual items themselves are getting bigger. And they're popping out. Not only that, but they start off tilted. So they're kind of stacked on top of one another. And this may seem a little bit weird because up until this point, everything has been about like laying out the overall grid items into these rectangular sections, making sure that nothing like does the wrong thing. And here we seem to be violating that. We're not really violating anything. We're taking advantage of the structure that grid gives us, but we're not constrained by that structure. Let me show you what this looks like. So here in our transform example, again, not really anything special in the HTML. We're basically saying that we want one of these captioned image components for every one of the images that we retrieved from some external data source. This captioned image, this is just a thing I made up. It's just a separate component, and it's going to have its own style rules. It's going to have its own little grid system associated with it. But we want to lay them out in a certain way. So here's the way that we lay them out. We said we want the whole thing to be display grid. We want to repeat automatically filling all the space with 75 pixel columns. That's our entire grid definition. That's what lets us resize this, and we automatically end up with everything moving around the way that we want it to. But we furthermore said that we don't want to be constrained by these individual rectangular areas. So for every one of these things, it's going to be like individual grid items, I've set it up so that as I hover over them, I run this examine animation. And the examine animation scales things up and rotates them back to 0. Unexamine scales them down and rotates them back to negative 15 degrees. In other words, when I hover over it, things get big and straighten up. When I go away, they go back to where they started. And just because we happen to be inside of a grid doesn't mean that we're stuck inside of that grid. Yes, in the HTML, you have these individual components, these individual HTML elements. They are laid out within a grid. If we go into Firefox and we take a look at our Dev Tools, you'll see that our grid layout really is there. If you look closely, there it is. But the individual items can escape their boundaries. So yeah, world's made of rectangles, but what you do with those rectangles and how you turn them around and how you decide to like work outside of their constraints, totally up to you, and Grid doesn't get in your way. All right. So in the same way that grid items are rectangles, but you're not really constrained by them, the grid itself, even though it's typically a rectangular layout, is also something that you don't have to be constrained to just like a flat layout. So some of you may remember this example from last year. Now at this point, we've seen a lot of complicated stuff. We've seen, those cards that expand and contract, images that automatically change their size based on the layout. This seems like an overly simple example. Why am I showing you this blank chessboard? Well, the reason I'm showing this to you is because I want you to realize that even though this is a grid, you can do things with that grid to make it not so stuck in rectangle land. So in this case, I can rotate the grid. So now my chessboard is on its side. I can change the perspective on it. We zoom out a little bit. You see the whole thing. So the grid itself can be moved and contorted so that you're not limited to just this flat, straight-on view. And this is a very powerful technique that we're going to see combined with stuff that we've seen so far in the next example. But while we're sitting here, there's one other thing I wanted to show you. Grid itself doesn't have a whole bunch of like animation capabilities built into it. There are a handful of properties that can be animated inside of Grid, but not a lot. The only one that's readily supported in all browsers is actually the grid gap. We do have a gap here. It's just really tiny. If we look at the grid definition for our chessboard, you'll see it's just 2 pixels. That's why it's so small. But gap is one of the few properties that can be animated. So if I got tired of playing chess and instead wanted to go to the disco, I can totally do that. And all I'm doing here is animating the grid gap between 2 pixels and something much larger. All the rotation and stuff still works. So the point here is not that I want you to have like disco dancing chessboards. I want you to realize that grid, even though it's wonderful for constraining your layout, doesn't actually have to constrain what you do with that layout. And here's what I mean by that. So let's put a lot of these items together and show something that looks fairly realistic. We'll do this one. This is just a simple video player, a video viewer. I've got a whole bunch of astronomical videos. Let's do this one, yeah. And this actually scrolls. So if you look very carefully, you can actually see the perspective is changing as I scroll on these things. So as I'm moving around, the size and shape of the individual preview items is changing. If I click on one of these, I actually do get a video. I can play this video. It's just coming from YouTube. This is not super responsive, but it does do the right thing as you begin to resize the screen. And all of this is done with a grid layout. Now, the first thing I want to show you is what the HTML for this looks like. So this is my video viewer. And the HTML literally consists of just a couple of components. There's the video list and the video player. This is all of the HTML for everything that you're seeing right there. There's really nothing extravagant about the HTML. All of this layout is happening in the CSS as God intended. That's what's supposed to be. So in here, we've got display grid. We've said grid gap of 0. We want tighter control over where everything is, so we don't want the individual spaces messing with us. And then we've set up a grid template, just like we did before. Now, this is a fairly simple grid template. We've really only got 2 things that we want to put inside of it. But there's one extra thing you haven't seen before, that dot. That's basically saying, I want this to be a dead space. I don't want anything to be here, but I want to use it for its space. So I've specifically said that the list, the video list on the left-hand side, is going to take up at least 200 pixels and up to 1.5 of the proportion of available space that's left over. I want the space between the list and the player to be half of one of those proportional units. And then finally, on the right-hand side, I want my player to take up at least 250 pixels, up to 2.5 times of the available, 2.5 pieces of the available space that's left over. That's what lays everything out left to right on my page. Everything else that's happening here is done with CSS magic. So if I go a little further down, I've said, put my video list in the list spot, my player in the player spot. But then my video list, I want it to be 130% of the height of the current viewport. Notice how it stretches off the top and the bottom. Even if I zoom way out, it still keeps stretching off the top and the bottom. Doesn't change. And that's by me setting it to specifically 130% of the height of the viewport. Everything else in here, pretty straightforward until we get down to the transform. The transform is what says, rotate this a little bit, move it a little bit, and rotate it along an axis that actually gives me some perspective. In fact, in the overall host container, the element that I'm sitting inside of, I said I want my perspective to be at 70 ems. That's what controls how distorted things look based on the perspective. If I come in here and I change this to like 170, you should be able to see a pretty different effect. So see how everything looks quite a bit flatter? If I change this to 30, things get bizarre. See how everything's more distorted. But all that's controlled by the perspective distance. And then once I start rotating things and translating things, the perspective distance affects how they actually look as if they were sitting in three-dimensional space. Everything else in here, though, is just pretty much details, like turning off the scroll bar on Firefox and turning off the scroll bar on Chrome. And then setting up a highlight so that as you move around, you can actually see what you're currently selecting. The important thing that I want you to take away from this, though, is that the HTML is just your stuff. Here is what we want on the page. All of your layout, all of your styling, all of the stuff that should be somewhere else is now somewhere else. It's over in the CSS, where it should be. All right, one last item that is arguably the most realistic of the examples. I've tried to make these examples memorable so that you'll be like, oh, I understand that technique. I understand what it's actually for. This one is very realistic. So I'm calling a full viewport application. I'll close off the Dev Tools here so you can see the whole thing. So what are we looking at? Well, we've got a header at the top, a footer at the bottom, but that footer is not like the Carl Sagan article. That footer actually stays in place. Now, I'm not using CSS position sticky for anything here. I'm simply saying I want to use grid layout to control the entire viewport. I've got a menu over here on the left-hand side that I can turn off and on, little hamburger button. Also controlled with grid. And all this content in the middle, this is just inside of a div that can scroll. If I resize the window, you'll notice everything stays in place as it should. I end up getting scroll bars where I would expect there to be scroll bars. Everything is great. That's what we want. So what did it take to build this? It's not actually all that hard. Here in our full viewport example, first thing I'll show you is the HTML. A little more HTML than you've seen before, but it's mostly so you can get things like that hamburger button. When you click on the hamburger button, the menu appears. When you click it again, it goes away. That's what this stuff is. We've got a button that toggles between showing and hiding the navigation. We've got the ability to click on the title and go back to a certain part of our application. So this is all the stuff that's in the header. In other words, this is the thing up here at the top that contains the word full viewport application and the menu button. We've got a nav section that is the left-hand, the sidebar that comes out when you click on the hamburger button. We got the main section. That's the part that's got all the cool space posters in it. Then down at the bottom, we've got the footer that's got links. Notice what we don't have. We don't have any layout. We don't have anything in this HTML that says where to put anything. As you would expect, that's over in the CSS. Here is the template for everything that you just saw. A couple of new things you haven't seen before, but we'll start with the stuff you already know. The header stretches across 2 columns. So we've got an overall 2-column layout here. The main section stretches across 2 columns, and the footer stretches across 2 columns. This seems bizarre. Why do we have 2 columns when literally everything is the same across both of those columns? The clue is that nav section that pops up. So I want to be able to have this nav section only take up a portion of my application's full viewport. I have 2 columns defined here because I want my nav start and nav end to only overlay that first column. That's where this 225 pixels comes from. If I change this to 525 pixels, you can probably guess the effect that we're going to see. See how much bigger our menu got? That's the leftmost column of our application. So even though the header and the footer and the main section, they all still take up the full width of the viewport, sometimes we want to change what the menu actually does. If you notice, by making it too big, I'm now sticking a little bit out on the screen. So let's put that guy back to where he should be. These things are called named grid lines. I was whining earlier about how grid lines start with 1. You don't have to care. You can actually name them. You can say that the leftmost line is actually called nav-start, and the rightmost line is called nav-end. Works great. Now we can actually refer to those lines by name, but even better, if we name them the way that I've done here with -start and -end, when I need to position something specifically in that area, I can just use the name nav. So if I go down here to nav, notice that the nav section is in grid area nav, but I never explicitly named an area nav. I simply said, here's where it starts, here's where it ends, here's where it starts, here's where it ends. In other words, I've constrained it with rows and columns, with the lines for the rows and the columns. Now I've got this brand new area called nav that didn't exist before, and it's sitting right here. So it's taking up that section, just by naming those grid lines. The only other bits that are important here is hiding and showing that area. So I've said that nav is going to show up in that particular area, but I don't want it to always be there. Normally, I want it to be way the hell to the left. So it's all the way off screen until I ask for it. And then when I ask for it, I can slide in and translate in on the screen, or I can slide out and translate it away. In other words, I can do this. But again, all this is still happening inside of a grid definition. So my nav bar is essentially sitting in that grid item, but I've then translated it away and translated it back when I want to see it. So I'm not constrained by the grid. The grid gives me the control that I want, and then I can decide how I actually want to use it. Other bits in here to point out, again, we've got grids inside of grids. The header itself is also a grid. So even though it's like the world's simplest thing, we've got a button on the left and we got some text out to the right, I wanted to make it easy on myself, and I said that is a display grid, and here is its template. It's going to take up as much space as it needs for the row. I'm going to take up as much space as I need for the nav toggle button, and then I'm going to let the title go from nothing all the way up to the available space that's left over. This is probably overkill for grid. A lot of people would use Flexbox for this, and there would be nothing wrong with using Flex for this. But I kind of wanted to show you that grid isn't just about 2 dimensions, even though it gives you control over 2 dimensions. I'm so comfortable with grid now that a lot of times when I used to reach for Flex, I just now reach for grid because I'm already kind of thinking in that mode already. So don't be shy about using it for single dimension layouts. You're still kind of using it for 2D. You're just not actually using the second dimension. That's exactly what I'm doing here. Everything else in here, just details, just more CSS stuff. Nothing really special about it. Kind of goes on for a bit, but it's all things that are pretty normal. All right, so bringing it home, we've seen the overall page layout capabilities of grid. We've seen that you don't have to be limited to just those page layout capabilities. You can have grids inside of grids, or you can use grids just at the component level. There's nothing that says you have to use a grid for your entire page. There's nothing that says you can only use a grid for your entire page. We've seen how we can combine those things with cool stuff like viewport units and CSS transforms to begin to put together more and more of an application's interface. The most important thing that I want you to take away from this, though, is that, again, CSS has kind of grown up over the last couple of years. Evergreen browsers now very consistently support things like grid, things like viewport units, things like all these 2D and 3D transforms. CSS is now a thing that you can trust. It's no longer just a source of endless frustration. Sometimes you have to do some additional work in order to be able to get grid to work in some older browsers. So for example, if you needed to support like IE11, you might need to take advantage of a thing called like auto prefixer. So if you've never seen auto prefixer, it's pretty cool. It gives you the ability to like retrofit a bunch of like grid stuff into older browsers. And it's kind of amazing the sort of miracles that things like auto prefixer can perform. But really, if you're living in the world of evergreen browsers, like current Chrome, current Firefox, Edge, Safari, you've got all this stuff available to you, and it actually works, and works very, very consistently. So with that in mind, I want to show you a set of resources. I mentioned at the very beginning a lady named Jen Simmons. Jen Simmons, dev advocate for Mozilla, does a lot of talking about layout, about grid. Fantastic YouTube channel called Layout Land. You should watch all of those videos. You'll learn so much. She's also got a wonderful website where she does a whole bunch of web design experiments. So even the very front page of her website, this thing is laid out with grid, and it's a responsive grid that as you resize down to a certain point, you'll actually see it turn straight. If you scroll down further on that page, you'll see all these cool things that she's done with grid. For example, she likes Piet Mondrian, and she's got responsive Mondrians. So she's like taken Mondrians apart and done interesting things with them. So if you didn't like the way Piet did it, you can make your own. A lot of them more practical than that. Things like image gallery layouts or magazine layouts. I love this one because she actually took a Jazz at Lincoln Center layout from a magazine and created it with grid. Very aesthetically pleasing. Really not easy to do unless you're using something like a table-based layout to do this. But if you look at the markup for this, it's just the elements. All the CSS is where the layout is controlled. The other name that I really want you to be aware of is Rachel Andrew. Rachel Andrew is who taught me grid. She doesn't know that, but I learned all of the things that I know about grid from Rachel first and then from Jen. She's got a fantastic website called Grid by Example, where she gives you all the information that you want to learn about grid, including a whole bunch of example layouts, as well as their fallbacks for browsers that don't yet support grid. There aren't a lot of browsers that don't support grid at this point. If you're on an evergreen browser, you've got the support, so you don't really need these things. But this is kind of a set of patterns. I want to be able to have this kind of layout. Rachel shows you how to do it. Speaking of browser support, I've got a reference here to Can I Use? So if you want to know whether or not your browser supports grid, almost certainly. Notice, we've had support in Edge since late 2017. We've had support in Firefox since mid-2017. Support in Chrome since even earlier than that. All the current versions of the Evergreen browsers support it. You really begin to fall off with things like Opera Mini. So your Opera Mini customers, sorry, they're out of luck. Maybe you can use one of the fallbacks for that. But the support is really fantastic. I mean, 92.36% global support for grid. This is not something you have to wait to use. And it's actually very easy to degrade to something that doesn't support grid, because typically your overall source order is good enough for whatever layout you're talking about. Grid just makes it better. So don't be shy about using it. Same thing for some of the other stuff that I mentioned. Viewport units have been around even longer than that. 2D and 3D transforms about the same amount of time. So modern CSS features really aren't all that modern anymore. They just haven't been something we've been used to using because we're scared of CSS. CSS is something that we haven't been willing to trust. Now we actually can. Other things here in the resources, I've got links to MDN for their overall grid reference. It's probably the best place to see what grid does kind of at a spec level, unless you're reading the spec itself, which I don't recommend because it was not written for humans. And then you've got CSS Grid Playground, which is really just Mozilla's introduction to grid. So they got these really handy pictures that show you things like what are grid lines, what are grid tracks, what are grid areas. So I recommend that you go take a look at that stuff. I've got links in here to other things, like if you want to get good with grid very quickly, you can use stuff like CSS Grid Garden, which is a gamified way of learning about grid. You can say, I need to water my plants by targeting certain areas. These are the same people that did Flexbox Froggy. So if you want to learn about Flexbox, you can also do that here, where you're trying to position frogs on top of lily pads, stuff like that. All right. Apart from that, I've got links in here to Wes Boss's CSS Grid course, a few other people like Una Kravitz for her fallbacks if you, again, need to support a much older browser that doesn't yet do grid. But for the most part, you probably want to hang out up here on these first three items. Really, really fantastic resources. Strongly, strongly recommend that you use them. All right. We're at about a minute, and I would really rather leave that minute for additional questions. So we're going to transition to questions at this point. Did I surprise you? I'm sorry.
Now. Now you can hear me. They are just changing for Slido. Some of you have already used it. In case you have questions, you can type them in like right now. So we are going to start with these. Your recommendation, when to use Grid and when Flexbox?
Typically what you hear from people is, Flexbox is about layout in a single dimension, Grid is about layout in 2 dimensions. And like I mentioned near the very end of the presentation, don't feel constrained by that. I actually find I guess you call it the API for Grid rules, a little more understandable than Flex. There are more moving parts, but those parts make more sense to me. When you really want to use Flex is when you need the flex part of it, the squishiness, the flexibility of Flexbox. Grid, by default, is somewhat more rigid. You can overcome that rigidity with things like FR units, but by default, it says these things go in these particular places. Flexbox is by default more flexible. So if you're working in a single dimension and you want to take advantage of that flexibility, then Flex is a good choice. In practice, I can tell you almost everything I do anymore is Grid, and I only reach for Flex when it's something Grid can't easily do, or when it would be awkward to do it in Grid. It would take quite a bit more code. I just am so much more comfortable with Grid that I tend to kind of default to it now. What you'll find as you use both of them is there are a huge amount of overlap kind of in their APIs. They can do a lot of the same stuff. You'll end up picking the one that you're most comfortable with. When you're first learning about Grid, though, I would recommend that you try to do everything with Grid so you don't fall back on Flexbox muscle memory.
And how can you fall back from Grid if there is no browser support?
First thing to understand is that @supports is still a thing. So if you're not familiar with that, in the same way that media queries can be used to say, @media and then give it some sort of media constraint, @supports can let you do things like @supports display :grid, and then you can set up all your grid stuff inside of that supports block, and your default configuration can simply be a non-grid layout. That's why I mentioned things like Luna Kravitz's Grid to Flex. She's got Flexbox fallbacks for browsers that don't support Grid. But again, you might be surprised at how much support you actually do have. Even on older browsers, like IE11, there's partial support. IE11, IE10, it's partial support only because Microsoft got to Grid before most other people did. So there's a big subset of Grid capabilities even in those older browsers. But if you truly do need to fall back to something completely non-Grid, then take a look at Una's stuff and take a look at Rachel Andrews' Grid by example, because she has fallbacks to each one of these examples.
To the next question, actually, I can answer that a bit. Yes, it is going to be available on craftconf.com, so double check the website next week-ish.
And if you want to know where it's going to be, I'll show you.
Okay.
It will be in a repo called Spacewalk on GitHub, but if you grab it right this second, first of all, you'll wreck the conference internet because there's like 100 megabytes of images. Don't do that. Secondly, I'm going to update it based on the latest examples here. So you can grab this one if you want, but come back and get it again in a couple of days when I have a chance to push the latest changes. But it's over on GitHub.
Thank you. Now you have more than one place to find it. Mm-hmm. Is Bootstrap dead?
I'm going to generalize the question. Are CSS frameworks dead? For layout, please, yes, let them die. Because you don't need them anymore. If you're working in evergreen browser land, or if you have a browser where there's a reasonable fallback, you do not need to adopt a CSS framework's grid system. We now have a grid system that's built into the browser that is way better than any of those grid systems. I mean, I have it sitting over here. Let's see. If you don't remember what it looked like to do a grid system in Bootstrap, let me just find some random example in here. Yeah, there you go. Before you even get any content in here, this is the sort of garbage that you're having to do. And I say that with nothing but love for Bootstrap. Bootstrap saved me over and over and over again during the era in which things like Bootstrap made sense. I just don't think they make sense anymore. That is not to say that there aren't other parts of Bootstrap, Foundation, Material, whatever, that aren't still useful. They are absolutely useful. But the layout portion you can leave behind. In fact, Bootstrap and other frameworks let you not load that portion of the framework. Like if you go into the SAS, you can actually say, don't pull in the layout classes. And then you don't have to worry about polluting your markup with any of this stuff. You just don't need it anymore.
Thank you so much. Even though we added that extra minute, now our extra 5 minutes of questions are over. But as Bill said, he's still going to be around and available to answer your questions. And I also saw that someone already said, thank you, awesome talk. There is a poll available at Slido, so please give feedback.
Yes, please do.
And that's actually all I have to say. Thank you so much, Bill, for really everything. And this is just a little something from the conference.
Oh,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well,
again, I'll be happy
you.
to stay as long as you want.